Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. This webinar. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. This webinar will start shortly. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. This webinar will start shortly. Good afternoon, good morning. This webinar will start shortly. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this live webinar coming to you from the Netherlands. In the next hour, we dive into the future of European supply chains and distribution networks. The event is moderated by Remco Buurman, the CEO of the Holland International Distribution Council. Remco will introduce today's program and speakers and will moderate the Q&A. Remco, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Stan, and welcome everyone at this webinar, The Future of European Supply Chains and Distribution Networks. First, for those who do not know HIDC, the Holland International Distribution Council, we are an association representing and promoting the Dutch logistics industry, and we are assisting foreign companies to start up and to develop their supply chains in Europe and to optimize their supply chains afterwards. Today we are in the middle, well, hopefully not in the middle, but we are still in a COVID-19 pandemic, which has a huge impact on European supply chains. As HIDC, we have published several Corona updates about the situation in Europe. And it turned out that Europe, and the Netherlands in specifically, has remained open for business. The logistics industry is actually not doing too bad at the moment in general. although some sectors are hit quite hard, like for instance, the automotive industry, but other sectors have been doing very well. E-commerce, food, health care, they are all doing quite well. But what will the future bring, and what will be the effect of this COVID-19 pandemic? One of the subjects which have been discussed many times is the topic of reshoring and nearshoring, how to build a resilient supply chain for the future, and that's the topic we will address today. We will start with a presentation of Fons de Zeeuw. He commissioned a study to assess the opportunities of reshoring, and he will tell us what the outcome of this study is. Secondly, Johan Beukema of Buck Consultants, he will give a presentation in which he will pay attention to the effects of the pandemic on supply chain distribution models. And we will finish our webinar with a presentation of Jurian Tapp of Blackman, and he will share his experience with nearshoring and reshoring in the fashion industry. There will also be some time left, hopefully, for questions and answers. For those who haven't worked with Teams, Microsoft Teams before, you can see the question mark, and if you tip on the question mark, you will be able to type in your questions, and afterwards we will try to answer as many as possible. Now, the first one I would like to hand over to is Fons de Zeeuw, Director International of the Regional Development Agency OostNL. Fons, please go ahead and tell us about the study you commissioned.
Thank you very much, Remco. Yeah, let me briefly introduce to you the study that we have conducted on reshoring. Well, the COVID-19 crisis has stimulated the discussion on supply chains being too complex, too long, and therefore too vulnerable. And the discussions on vulnerable supply chains often end up in considering reshoring. I will present you some of the highlights of a recent study on reshoring that was done by Buck Consultants internationally, jointly with the East Netherlands Development Agency OostNL. Slide 2, please. In this study, reshoring refers to moving a manufacturing activity back to the home country. A manufacturing activity that has been in the past been offshored to a low-cost location far away. And the low-cost location in this study is China, and the home country in this study is the Netherlands. For this study, an imaginary high-tech company was chosen as a model. And here on this slide, you see the characteristics of this imaginary company. It is a Dutch company with 250 employees and manufacturing operations in coastal China. Next slide, please. The imaginary company presently has all 4 production lines in China. This is the as-is situation, or scenario 0. Scenario 1 means 100% reshoring by bringing all 4 production lines back to the Netherlands. Scenario 2 refers to 50% reshoring, and scenario 3 refers to 25% reshoring. Next slide, please. Now, Buck national and regional statistics and also data from recruitment firms for calculating the production costs in all 4 scenarios. The production cost you see in category A. Also, the quality of the business environment was quantified and compared for all 4 scenarios. And the same was done for risk factors related to meeting the customer expectations. Buck did a very nice job by specifying all dimensions into sub-indicators. For example, labor cost, A1, one of the 4 dimensions of production cost, is subdivided into 3 indicators. The cost for management and administration, the cost for general manufacturing, and the cost for engineering. And in this way, most dimensions have been specified into various sub-indicators. Next slide, please. Well, as expected, it reveals that in terms of production costs, China is much more attractive as a production location than the Netherlands. The higher labor cost in the Netherlands is the key driver. And the higher labor costs in the Netherlands do not offset the lower transportation cost in the reshoring scenario. Next slide, please. It reveals that the Netherlands scores 15% higher than China in terms of the quality of the business environment. The Netherlands clearly outperforms China in all quality indicators except the one on labor availability. The IP violation risk is extremely high in China, which is an unfavorable situation for very innovative companies. Indeed, next slide, please. The Netherlands scores almost 60% higher than China on meeting customer expectations. And the Netherlands clearly outperforms China on all factors related to meeting the customer expectations. Next slide, please. If you would translate the findings of the scenario analysis into, let's say, management jargon, the conclusion would be, if the imaginary company would go for operational excellence, with a focus on cost efficiency, reshoring would probably not be rewarding for this particular company. If the imaginary company would focus on product leadership, quality, high quality, reshoring might be relevant for this company. And if the imaginary company would focus on customer intimacy, co-creation with your client, reshoring should certainly be considered by this company. Last slide, please. Well, in addition to the quantitative scenario analysis, we conducted also in-depth interviews with executives of 8 companies in East Netherlands on the issue of reshoring. And it reveals that 6 out of 8 companies consider themselves too dependent on manufacturing in the Far East or elsewhere in Europe. And it reveals also that 4 out of 8 companies consider reshoring a serious option to be investigated. And a key driver in this is the de-risk of the supply chain. However, we have the impression that most companies have other priorities right now at this moment, and seriously considering reshoring is will probably be postponed until after the current COVID crisis. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fons, for this very interesting presentation. Very interesting to learn that there are certainly opportunities for nearshoring for all those companies. Costs, of course, if they are a main driver, then the Far East is still very serious options. But I think the other elements you mentioned, like customer satisfaction, is becoming more and more important. So that also opens up the opportunities for nearshoring. But let's immediately get on with Johan, because he is one of the consultants who was involved in the study of OostNL. Johan, can you tell us more about the future of the European supply chains and what role nearshoring and reshoring play in this respect?
Absolutely. Thanks, Remco, and thanks in general to HIDC and OostNL for inviting me to present to the audience today. It's my pleasure. And where Fons was talking mainly about manufacturing reshoring, my focus in the presentation will be a little bit more to the downstream supply chain today, but I'll touch upon real manufacturing and sourcing developments as well. Please go to the next slide. So I'm working with a company called Buck Consultants International, or BCI Global, as we call ourselves outside of the Netherlands. We have our own global footprint around the globe with our headquarters in the Netherlands and 70 professionals around the globe, supporting companies like I've been doing in my 21 past years here at BCI, in supporting companies to optimize their supply chains around the globe from an end-to-end perspective, sourcing, manufacturing, distribution, optimization, and everything that comes with that. Apart from working with corporations on that type of questions, we're also working with public clients, mainly regions, national development agencies, etc., in order to develop strategies to attract foreign companies. Next slide, please. We're very proud as a company to be able to work for leading companies in industries such as shown here on the slide. I'm not going in detail here, it's just to show you what my story today is based on. Next slide. Similar types of customers in different types of industries. Now let's go into the content of today's presentation, and let's start with the question, why should companies be thinking of redesigning their supply chains, optimizing their supply chains from a global, pan-European as well as a market perspective? But there are four key drivers that we typically come across, and the top ones, the internal drivers as well as the industry drivers, so drivers very close to the individual company, where companies have a maximum or at least a significant level of control and influence themselves. They were the classic drivers behind this kind of initiatives. We see in the last few years, and certainly that is boosted now through the whole COVID pandemic, that the external drivers and the environmental drivers, think of natural disasters, think of the current example of a pandemic, but also think about geopolitical developments, trade wars, etc., have become much more the key drivers behind this kind of optimizations within the end-to-end supply chain. On the next slide, zooming in a little bit to the COVID topic, and why is COVID different? We got that question as well from a number of clients 8-7 months ago. And we think there are a couple of reasons why COVID is different than other issues that have been occurring in terms of tsunamis, in terms of ash clouds, all the events that we are all familiar with. First of all, COVID is really global and not regional. The scope is very widespread, again, on a global basis. It affects demand and possibly supply, where in the past, in major supply chain disruptions, the issue was mainly on the supply base side and not so much on the demand side. So that's a major difference as well. And the fact, and I'll talk about that in a minute in more detail, companies were just not prepared for this kind of major disaster on a global basis. So limited disaster planning was in place. And of course, it's longer term emergency service needs and the widespread impact just on human beings in total. Everybody is still experiencing that every day. On the next one, COVID has clear impacts on global supply chains. Already before summer, we defined these 5 key impacts as we saw them coming up in the projects that we are running with companies. Obviously, the dependency on China manufacturing as well as China supply. That's directly related to the case that Fons was just presenting. The overall complexity of global value chains. The world has been globalizing, supply chains have been globalizing for decades for good reasons, and companies have been focusing on setting up those optimized global value chains, but they've been now experiencing the hard way what kind of risk comes with that. Related to that, lack of supply chain visibility. If you have those global value chains, something happens, you need to have visibility in order to be able to manage an issue coming up. If you don't have the visibility, like many companies don't have, at least not to the needed extent, then you have a big issue as a company. And that's what people have been experiencing. Sudden drop in demand, clearly, that's the business impact here. And the only real positive one here on the slide is the unexpected accelerated rise of e-commerce. So e-commerce was already booming, was already increasing, but that rise really boomed further here with all its own more positive challenges coming with it. So let's go a little bit deeper there. And what are companies doing? In our projects, we see that companies are following what we call the D strategies. So they're decoupling China US, China, Europe links. This is not completely new because this whole trade war was already ongoing. So companies were already looking at this, but COVID clearly gave this a boost. The same accounts for de-risking supply chains from an overall perspective. I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a minute. De-single sourcing, again, something that's not new, but companies have now been confronted with the big risk of still having single sourcing out there in the supply chain and are now working faster to get that kind of issue solved. And decentralization of production, reshoring, near sourcing, everything that comes with it. So let's go again a level deeper here on the next slide. In terms of de-risking the supply chain, what a lot of companies have been finding out is that risk analysis itself, think about the typical probability risk type of analysis, making a good list of what kind of risks do we have in our supply chain and what is the probability that a risk will occur and what will then be the impact. It's not enough. It's really necessary nowadays to put kind of the buzzword, the fashion word resilience really into practice and making sure that supply chains are able to react if something happens by having not only the risks into the picture, so not only having a risk database, but also having the competencies in place in terms of organization to act if something happens, regardless of what that something is. So regardless of the nature and origin of that event happening. If we look at companies that are already pretty far in that respect, I'm thinking about a company like Cisco, who already many years ago saw the importance of this kind of organizations and building resilience. Of course, because they have a significantly outsourced supply chain in place. And if you want to secure and de-risk that supply chain, then you need to have visibility on where are my risks, but also have, like they set up, a virtual global risk management organization in place to be able to act there. Studies and this example of our colleagues of McKinsey show that global supply chain leaders are now taking this seriously. So almost all respondents in this survey said, yes, we're planning to increase resilience in our company. And about half of the companies said, hey, we would even do that at the expense of short-term savings. So in other words, we would be willing to increase our cost a bit if we are able to increase the level of resilience in our supply chain. And you can read in the chart what kind of actions they are then planning to take in the supply chain. On the next slide, this is kind of the conceptual model that we use when we are being asked to help companies to work on increasing resilience. I won't go into all the details here. Key is the 3 building blocks in the middle. It's about the technology and infrastructure where companies can take action. It's in the organizational part. I gave the example of Cisco. And it's in the footprint, the physical network of locations around the globe. And that's what I'll be diving a little bit deeper into in the next few slides. We see currently companies working on 5 types of footprint strategies. In the remaining slides, I'll go deeper into the green ones here, decentralization of distribution, as well as the topic of value-added services, value-added logistics, and postponement. But we also see companies just increasing inventory levels in their distribution chains. We also see companies looking at near sourcing. Hey, can I source materials closer to where I have manufacturing without relocating the actual manufacturing piece? And again, to France's case, we see companies looking at decentralizing production or really reshoring production. Now let's go a little bit deeper in the next slides into the 2 green blocks here. And first of all, again, and this time from an own BCI survey recently done, it's clear almost 80% of the respondents here said, yes, we have the need to review our network in the next 18 months. And about 30% of them said, hey, it's both about the manufacturing and the distribution network. Another 30% said, yes, but the focus is mainly on the manufacturing network because that's where we need to do something. And still 15% said, hey, it's about the distribution network only. So there is a clear need there. On the next slide, of course, this need is different industry sector by industry sector. So in the examples as shown here on the slide, if you look at decentralized distribution, but I could almost draw the same picture for decentralized manufacturing. On the food industry, in general, food companies have a fairly decentralized setup already by origin, and we don't expect that will significantly change. In the high-tech industry, it's different. It's a fairly centralized supply chain setup, and we do expect that is one of the industry sectors where action will be taken in the period to come. So there we expect that the level of decentralization will become higher. And look at what we depicted there for e-commerce distribution, where we expect a little bit more increase also due to the growth. So the level of scale that individual companies will get, individual markets will get for companies in that segment. And for consumer electronics, we expect not too much of a change. So you need to look industry sector by industry sector. What is the way to go here in terms of how far can you go decentralizing your distribution? The next slide will show that even within specific industry segments, companies make different choices. And again, this is not a COVID-driven slide. This is comparing companies in more or less the same industry segment and looking at what is the number of main distribution centers, central distribution centers these companies have in Europe. I'm not going through each of the four individual examples here, but you see that similar type of companies make different decisions in terms of their supply chain structures. And what we see on the left-hand side, the fairly centralized companies, a lot of those companies are now investigating, hey, what would further decentralization bring for our company? Would that cost-wise work? And to what extent would we be able to mitigate risks in the chain if we would decentralize further? Companies on the right-hand side with a more dispersed network, we've seen in the last few years, look a lot at, hey, what would more consolidation bring for us, right? A lot of those initiatives we have seen over the last 8 months being put on hold because companies said, hey, at this moment, we're pretty satisfied with our more decentralized setup. So question is, what will happen there in the next few years? Next slide. The example of value-added logistics or postponed assembly. This is a recent case of a project I worked on myself for a high-tech medical device manufacturer who were doing their final assembly historically at one location, in this case in China. And they are now really working, based on the study we did together, to decentralize that activity, or better said, to regionalize that activity. So they want to create autonomous supply chains, more or less autonomous supply chains around the globe, to de-risk their supply chain. And what they found out is, because they are closer to market, that they can also bring their distribution costs down by adopting this model. Of course, it's not something that can be implemented from day 1 to day 2, because this company will also need to work up setting up new supplier bases and supplier ecosystems in the continents where they are not manufacturing at this moment. But this is clearly something that is going to be implemented in the next few years. On the next slide. Is it then so easy? And why are not all companies at this moment decentralizing their supply chains, their manufacturing and distribution footprints? Well, that's because there are clear barriers. It's about scale. For companies with a smaller scale, smaller manufacturing and distribution operations, the business case will be hard if you break an already not so big operation up into even smaller pieces. So scale is an important factor there, but also governance and planning systems, right? The more dispersed you make your footprint, the more complex it will be to manage and plan the flows within and the activities within such a network. And that is, again, related to the fourth barrier depicted here, the requirements from a systems and IT, etc. perspective. So there are clear barriers for decentralization as well, and they need to be factored into the case company by company as well. The next slide. So a couple of change drivers that I've been presenting on the left-hand side, I won't repeat them. What we see, and that's also pretty interesting, is that companies are starting to look differently at network design changes and are looking differently at doing network optimization projects. They're doing that with a higher frequency. They're doing that even more data-based than before. They're doing that even more end-to-end than before. So you see that companies are now building up capabilities in-house for doing this kind of continuous network optimization, where in the past it was more a once every 5-year exercise, for example. Next slide. So the second last slide here is, okay, what does this then mean for distribution operations in Europe? Well, we all have to suffer still from the economic part of this crisis, and it will take some time before we're back on track. So that's the thumb down aspect here. But from the eyes of the logistics community, in our view, there's also a couple of pretty positive developments here. The growth of e-commerce brings opportunities. The fact that some companies are choosing to keep higher inventories closer to the market will also lead to opportunities for example, logistic service providers, for regions, etc. And the fact that value-added logistics, final assembly, secondary packaging and labeling, companies are considering to locate those activities closer to market will also bring their own opportunities. What does that then mean for the Netherlands, to close off on my last slide here? And this is a little bit crystal ball, of course, but our view and my personal view at this moment is summarized as follows. And we think in terms of the Netherlands as an important gateway to Europe, that position of the Netherlands will not change. So that means there's still an opportunity there. Also, for companies that need a classical Central European distribution center setup, the Netherlands is still a very attractive location, especially for higher value products. For lower value, more bulky products, we see the interest in Central and Eastern Europe increasing. And to be honest, a lot of those countries then also have a strong business case that is very competitive versus the Netherlands or the surrounding countries here in Western Europe. So that's also a fact of life. For companies that are decentralizing distribution in Europe, the profile, obviously, of the DCs in the Netherlands will change. The service area will change because it's not pan-European anymore. It may lead in some cases to a smaller footprint. On the other hand, take the example of e-commerce, you see also a lot of operations that are turned into a more regional, so smaller scope operation, but still physically the operation is only growing because the market is growing so fast. Finally, following the reshoring and decentralization of manufacturing trend, the Netherlands are, from our perspective, not so well positioned for the classical big scale, classical labor-driven manufacturing, but for final assembly, postponed packaging and labeling operations, we think there's a real opportunity for the Netherlands. In all honesty, as an independent consultant, I need to add to that, but so are the surrounding countries. So that's the competitive arena that the Netherlands has to fight in. So there are clearly threats of the current situation. There's a lot of competition, but I want to close off with the positive message. There are also still a lot of good opportunities out there.
Thank you very much, Johan. That was a very clear and interesting presentation again. I see that some first questions have come in, and I also have some questions myself, but I will keep those questions till after our next presentation. Please, if you are listening and have any questions, use the Q&A box. We will try to answer as many questions as possible after the last presentation. And if we do not have enough time, we will answer those questions on our website. So please don't hesitate to ask your questions. Final and last presentation of today is a presentation by Jurian Tap. He's the Business Development Director of Blackman, with a lot of experience in the fashion industry, and he will tell us what is happening in this industry when it comes to nearshoring and reshoring. Jurian, please go ahead.
Thank you, Remco, and obviously also to Fons and Johan. There's definitely some similarity in what we have experienced from our industry perspective, focused on the fashion and lifestyle segment that was clearly so introduced by Remco, and maybe on the next slides, Dan. I'll give you a quick introduction also of our company. If I would have added a map of the world, Johan, it would look the same as yours, with the exception of the west coast of the US, and I had to add Melbourne, but the rest is almost identical. Having said that, we are the guests of OostNL today. Our heritage is in 1862 in Oldenzaal in Twente, east of Holland. That's where Benjamin Blackman started the company, and since then we've emerged into a pretty global organization, although admittedly our vast majority of our footprint is in the Benelux and predominantly in Holland. Some of the brands that we work for you see here, we're equally proud of each of them, and there's about 1,000 in total of those. Next step, please. So what it means is that we have a company of around 350 million euro, roughly 4,000 people, but as our business and our fashion clients are very seasonal, the last weeks you can imagine it was a bit busier with Black Friday around the corner, so we easily add another 1,000 people for a few weeks that then leave us for a while and come back hopefully soon. And I've also indicated a few examples of accolades that we recently received. One that we're particularly proud of, that we were #1 in the e-commerce 100 for the e-fulfillment solution providers, because already half of our business today comes from e-commerce. So echoing the one before last slide of Johan, obviously that allows us to grow a lot, including predominantly in Holland. Next one, please. So what I've done here is I've taken one of our business intelligence tools and just did a download of what happened in the last year. So I want to look back with you. It's that time of the year where we start looking back. Maybe I'm a bit early. But on the left-hand side, you see what happened to our business-to-business environment, distribution to shops, department stores. And on the right-hand side, you see the same for e-commerce. So the message of my slide here is that when COVID hit us and surprised us all, demand dropped like never seen before. I've seen some of the comments made by Johan on how global and how intense it all was. So demand disappeared. E-commerce took over somewhat, although everybody was a bit careful. What will happen to my job? Will I still be able to pay my bills tomorrow? And then you see another drop at the end of the year on the left, the last few weeks. But also, fortunately, some store reopenings now in France, for example, that has impact on how we typically do distribute, because many of our clients are typically pan-European solutions that we provide out of Holland. And on the right-hand side, you see the effect of Black Friday. You read about it in the newspapers. This is another way of looking at it. So what happened to our customers? So those that were agile enough, they were able to convert quickly to sell more online. Depends on their systems, on their strategies, etc. But they might still make something of a bad year. Others were in deep trouble. And those that saw the opportunity to still sell something because the markets reopened, they had to quickly get stock in because they cancelled orders, they postponed production. You've read the stories about Bangladesh, India, China suppliers that were struggling to still get their orders. So the whole world was in panic. And those that got it wrong in terms of excess stock, they found alternative solutions. I mentioned a few that we work with that typically then become the solution for excess stock and still make some money out of a bad season. Next, please. So what did people then do? They regrouped and said, well, we have to think about what do we do. The immediate consequences of all that was happening is that shipping costs today are ridiculously high in terms of Asia to here have never been so expensive. People had to think about, do we reopen? When can we reopen? And also, how do we finance our next season? Our customers, fashion customers, typically have big seasonal kind of production schemes, and they sell something in spring, and with that they finance the fall and winter collection. So if there was no sales in spring, they had no cash left for the fall and winter collection, and unfortunately the banks don't help them at the moment, because the banks say, well, you're not our #1 priority to send our cash to, because we find you a very scary business at the moment. So people struggle to get their financing done. What did they do? Well, we've seen a lot of financial restrictions among our customers, certainly the American and Canadian brands, and that's quite a big chunk of our customer base. They used the momentum to refinance the company, restructure, close a couple of stores, stop some of the department store relationships, or the department stores themselves went out of business, and convert as much as possible to e-commerce. There's lots of great statistics on how that works out, but you see that although some of the wholesale retail is coming back, it's never at the same level as before. So e-commerce has won. People that tried it once will return now. It's also the older generation that were a little bit risk averse, or some of the countries that were not yet that used to buying online, that have immediately converted now, and they will repeat those orders. We see that in our business. To be honest, it saves our year. For a logistics provider, that's a very positive trend. The other thing is very practical. People will, although every year has to be a complete different color, this year they will reuse a little bit some of the styles so they can mix and match a little bit last year's stock with new production, so we can still sell some of that production that was meant to be sold a year ago. Some of that is stored here, some of it is stored still remotely at the origin. And most importantly, people are trying to say, can we not buy more frequently but smaller production cycles, so smaller batches as a result, and then we start talking about nearshoring as part of the solution. Next, please. So what does it mean in terms of reshoring, nearshoring? A lot of terminology. I guess, Remco, but you are more into the academic side of it, but reshoring to me would be people going back home with their production, and nearshoring, people going nearby. For our customers, the typical logistical base out of Western Europe, Holland, is still attractive, although I do echo some of the comments that Johan made, and I will add to that too. But manufacturing typically for our clients takes place in countries like Turkey now, or Portugal, or Spain, or North Africa. So a little bit closer by than just China, India, Bangladesh. That was the old solution. Why do they do it? It's not only a trend, it's also because people think it's a more sustainable solution. It becomes increasingly important for our clients. People see it as an alternative to single sourcing. It's also not only the lockdown risk, but also political risks. As China is a big supplier to many of our customers, China's relationship with, for example, the US makes them rethink, like, hey, we can't put all our eggs in one basket if a political situation gets more tense. But also obviously supporting the idea of having more and fewer batches at a time typically corresponds with having a manufacturing location a little closer by. With that, and also some of the fiscal aspects that we shouldn't forget, Remco, when we talk about Holland, we always should mention that that's a great opportunity for many, including if you starting production in EU-based countries. However, what I also noted here is more upstream, there is still sourcing of the fabrics or the unique pieces that you need that can still happen remotely. I have lived in China for 5 years, and I remember that one of the cities not so far from where we lived were actually the global hub for all the zippers in the world. And without one, you can't make pens, or, well, there's some alternatives, but you still need a lot of them. So having said that, more upstream, making sure that all your components are still in your chain may still lead to vulnerability all across the line. The second half of this page addresses also what you saw back in Johan's address, is the solution of the strategy around distribution centers. We've had a couple of customers calling us that said we have our warehouse in Italy and all of a sudden it's closed now. This was earlier in the year after the spring skiing season, when all the Italian manufacturing closed down. And we were then the alternative to that only hub they had. Can you guys get us up to speed in a few weeks, because we're in trouble? I think people learn from that, and they want to have more than one hub also as a plan B. Secondly, I've mentioned it here, it's also that time of the year. Brexit comes back a lot in discussion with our clients, and so having a second hub, for example, in the UK would be also, or the other way around for British-based brands, a second hub in Holland would be a good alternative for risk mitigation also on that end. And lastly, people want to be closer to their final consumer, and therefore what you see is indeed more but smaller distribution centers, and that also corresponds with some of the investments we are doing and what our customers ask us. So what's the flip side? To me, a couple of them, you still have the complexity of managing your stock, and that gets even more complex if you distribute it over more hubs. Getting your inbounds right, and deciding where and how much to stock is a challenge. Next one, please. So to conclude my part, what do we do as a company to support our clients? First of all, we've invested in a group of people that come from and that were based in the countries that our customers are now looking at. Turkish-speaking, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian-speaking colleagues have added, next to some Eastern European expertise, Poland, for example, as typical hubs that we get confronted with by our clients. So that team is in place, and they're making a great progress in talking to all the vendors, for example, of our clients, to also get a perspective from that angle. We're also expanding in terms of footprint, like we also saw in the study by BCI, is that certainly the shift to e-commerce leads to a big demand in terms of footprint. So we are adding a lot of capacity at the moment, but we're also looking at opportunities to invest in these countries a bit more south and east of Europe, because indeed some of our customers expect us to have secondary hubs for them for the reasons that we mentioned. That means a lot of systems related investment. We have more than 100 people in our IT department, and quite a few of them these days are busy trying to build order management solutions, APIs to connect to our customers, and making sure that we have single platforms across these hubs. In other words, our customers want us to use exactly the same setup and the same system and the same interface, regardless if that manufacturing communicates with our DC in Holland or the UK or the US, if you like. So quite a bit of investments in IT. What we see a lot also is that our colleagues in our freight department get very, very busy supporting, not only to mitigate all this horrible cost that we have at the moment, but also the strategies to manage vendors, to decide what goes to what hub, create visibility, help them make decisions on that, sourcing strategies. So that's become quite a big part of our activities at the moment. And lastly, obviously with the likes of people like BCI, who are often our counterparts in these projects, either on the client side or we might call them, but at the end of the day, also our engineers are working alongside the consultants of our clients to make sure that we design a solution that's future-proof and, to use that word, resilient enough and flexible enough to make sure that they're future-proof. So these are just a couple of examples from our perspective, and also our typical client base that we work for.
Thank you very much, Jurriaan, for this clear insight in the fashion industry and what's happening in this industry from a supply chain perspective. It's a bit more than just nearshoring and reshoring. The whole world of supply chain redesign is really very, very active at the moment. A lot is happening. Let's go to some questions. First, I would like to ask one question to Fons de Zeeuw. Fons, you're one of the regional development agencies, one of the many in the Netherlands. You're part of the Invest in Holland network, just like we are as HIDC. Together we are trying to attract new foreign investors for the Netherlands. But well, as it shows right now during this study as well, you're also trying to find out how you can help current investors in your region. Can you tell a little bit more about that? You just showed an example for this with this study. Are there any other ways you help those current investors?
Yes, a regional development agency such as OostNL can provide a very broad range of services. Once a company is located in our region, we may, for example, provide investment capital for a company to grow, or we can provide access to EU programs, or we can provide or at least support access to foreign markets. And for foreign investors that are not yet present in our region, we can assist them in site selection, location selection. We do it free of charge. And of course, regularly we collaborate with your organization. Well, maybe good to say, Remco, that you provide some very interesting services as well, huh, with your organization.
Yes, that's correct, Fons. We do the same. Of course, we assist foreign companies to start their business here in the Netherlands. But once they are here, we also try to help them to introduce them to the right partners here in the Netherlands. And also, if they want to further optimize the supply chains, our consultants are ready for advice. So I think I really appreciate the cooperation also with the regions, also with the Netherlands Foreign Investment Agency. And I think together we are able to help all those companies which have an establishment here in the Netherlands. So thank you very much, Fons. Then some questions from the audience have come in. Johan, maybe a first question to you. You mentioned de-risking as becoming more and more important. One of the viewers asks, well, how does that affect the investment decisions? Does it become an element in those investment decisions, and in which sectors in specifically? I think you already mentioned the food industry. Can you tell a little bit more how the de-risking will affect the investment decision of the future?
Yeah, thank you, Remco, and thanks for the question from the audience. It's a good question. The easy answer to in which sector specifically is, if I look at our project portfolio, it's basically across the board. So in all sectors where we are doing projects optimizing end-to-end supply chains, the factor of risk and how to mitigate risk in your physical footprint is a key factor. And that's already for a couple of years. And the weight of that factor in the total consideration is still increasing. So from that perspective, risk is a very important factor and is only gaining importance. And I would say it's really across the board in all different industry sectors that we are working in.
Thank you. One of the elements I heard as well is, for instance, the whole healthcare system of a country. Is that becoming an important factor for an investment decision?
It is. What I see, again, just from my own practice, is that especially accounts for investments where companies plan to bring in also significant higher level type of expat people into a country. So if they want to bring, for example, headquarter people to a new foreign country where they're going to do a new investment, then they want their people to land in a location where the healthcare system is in place, where in general it is attractive for people to live and where they can land in a safe and good environment, right? So yes, we see that as an explicit factor. Also must be honest, that's not for all projects the same. So if we talk about more low-skilled, basic, labor-driven manufacturing, we hardly see this as an explicit factor.
And any other new factors becoming important for an investment decision?
No, I would not say many more new factors. It's more that the weight of factors is changing. So it's always about the balance between cost, qualitative, and risk factors. But the weightings are just flipping a bit from the cost side only to more emphasis on certain qualitative factors and for sure to the risk factors.
Thank you very much. Then Jurian, for you also a question. You mentioned the nearshoring that's taking place to countries like Spain, Italy, Turkey, Morocco, you mentioned, I think. And you also mentioned the single sourcing, and that fashion companies are looking for other solution where they can use more sources. Does this also offer opportunities for other countries in Asia, like Bangladesh, Vietnam, Indonesia? Or is it really the next phase that companies are going back to Europe and surrounding countries?
I think it's probably a bit of both, and I think in one of the slides of Johan, you saw that those that get central became more decentral, those went too decentral look at more. So we're constantly looking for that equilibrium in opportunities to get it right. It's probably a mix. So when you take it to the fashion companies, they may have had their never out of stock mass kind of production items that they still would look for the lowest place, the lowest cost place that they can find, and then complement it with things that have to be in fashion and wait as long as possible, postpone the decision to get the colors right. You know, the old Zara type cases, they're still good, but there's more hybrids there. We see a lot of kind of drop-based models coming up where people don't produce and keep on repeating, but basically they produce and when it's sold out, it never comes back. So they create scarcity, which works very well on online environments. And we have some great examples of customers that are dropping something at midnight at first day, and 2 minutes later, the item is sold out. And they're creating that scarcity, and that requires them a different strategy on how to source. If you look at the specific countries that you mentioned, I think some countries around China have benefited from the fact that China were seen as a bit of an issue. Yes, and Cambodia, Vietnam, those are typically the ones that benefited in that time. For this more like nearshoring strategy, I think the countries we just talked about are indeed the right ones, where the access to labor is an important factor that also plays a bit to your previous question. Some of the countries closer by have ample labor capacity at the moment to provide at good cost. So that makes places like Portugal and Spain all of a sudden more attractive to our customers, at least than they were a few years ago, being afraid of not finding enough and skilled and payable labor resources. So you see that political play a role, but also economical considerations make people think about, hey, we have an alternative now to doing everything in India or doing everything in China, for example.
Thank you, Jurian. I have another question for Johan. Johan, you talked about operations in Eastern Europe. You were talking about the bulky operations, the low added value. But one of the questions is, wouldn't it be better to locate the labor-intensive operations like postponement and value-added logistics in Eastern Europe? What is the reason to remain in the western part of Europe?
I think the person asking the question is absolutely right. So the more labor intensive and the more labor cost driven an operation is, I would almost say naturally lower cost locations like the ones in Central and Eastern Europe are more interesting. So I think for the Netherlands, those operations are interesting, where operations are more automated, less dependent on labor, maybe sometimes also smaller scale, where it's about higher value types of products. And that's also what we see in recent research, where there is a direct link with the knowledge base in the Netherlands. Right? So if those components are in place, an operation becomes more attractive for the Netherlands. If it's purely about low labor cost, well, then the Netherlands clearly is not on top of the list.
Thank you. I think that's clear, yeah. And also referring to the study of OostNL, if you make the comparison between the quality of the services in the Netherlands to China, the quality of the work and the quality we can offer, of course, is much higher than in Eastern Europe. I think also in comparison with Eastern Europe, which means that the higher value goods definitely can better be distributed out of the Netherlands than out of those countries. Then an actual question, Jurian, for you maybe. We all see the problems with the availability of containers and the spot prices doubling at the moment. One of the questions is, how can we now minimize the cost due to this container crisis? What's the solution you are offering to your clients?
Well, we can't do magic, unfortunately, although we're trying. But so at a very, very short term, we are all struggling with the same demand. There's options where you can break a chain down in steps and do part by sea and part by air, etc. But what we can see is this is not so much only for the immediate kind of inbound challenge, is that We work with, certainly on the outbound side, more than 50 providers in our network, and they're all connected through an integral IT platform. So we have been making a lot of switches in the last weeks with partners that could not provide enough capacity. So we had the same struggle also, for example, delivering that last mile around Black Friday. We have a lot of the challenges now with Brexit. And even this morning, certain suppliers announcing certain standstills over the New Year's period because of the uncertainty. So being agile enough to switch providers, both on the in and the outbound, is probably our way of trying to mitigate as much as we can for our customers the total cost. Obviously, the longer term effect is exactly what we just talked about today, is making sure that you're not depending on that single source and all compete for that same ship or aircraft.
Thank you. I see some last questions coming in, so let's try to answer them as well. Johan, what should we focus on besides the availability of labor, of course, to remain the #1 gateway in Europe?
I think it's a bit related to my earlier answer. I think it starts with focus on projects that really fit the strength of the Netherlands. And with that, I would say also realize and accept that requirements of companies are changing sometimes. So if they are changing into a different, for example, more regionalized or decentralized European structure, then the position of the Netherlands may change. For example, the outbound distribution profile with the Netherlands, for example, parcel distribution is extremely well positioned on a pan-European basis. If that's not so important anymore because the catchment area of the distribution center is smaller, then I would say make sure that other aspect of the gateway to Europe, namely the inbound supply chain into Europe through the Netherlands, that you position that even stronger and that you make sure that is made even stronger. Improvements are being made and also profiled from a competition perspective into the market. So I think it's really about focus, and it's about accepting that the role of the Netherlands may change, and that I think especially the strength on the inbound side flows from far away into Europe. The Netherlands' position will remain as it is.
Thank you. Well, I think that is a great finish of this webinar. It's almost 5 o'clock. Actually, now it is 5 o'clock here in the Netherlands. I would like to thank OostNL for co-organizing this webinar. I would like to thank the speakers, Johan and Jurian, for your great presentations. And I would like to thank the audience for attending this webinar. Thank you all. And if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. We will organize some more webinars next week, for instance, one about the Brexit as well. So we hope to welcome you again, and you all have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.